Today's topic is cancer, a new old theory. And the reason I say it's old is because it's been around for a long time. The reason I say that it's new is because most people haven't heard of it, or doctors, in fact, haven't heard of it, or don't pay much attention to it. So, in this lecture, we'll talk about the theory, the development of the theory, why cancer develops, not only from a physiological point of view, but also from a mental, emotional. Cancer answer. What is the answer? So, according to Dr. Otto Warburg, there is one common cause for cancer to develop. Now, does anybody know who Otto Warburg was? Most people haven't heard of him. Okay. Dr. Otto Warburg was a German Jewish doctor. He was employed by the German army even in World War I. He started studying the development of cancer in people, and he did his research for 40 plus years. In fact, in 1924, he won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1944. During that time, World War II was going on. And Hitler didn't allow him to go to accept his award. Now, some of you should be questioning this. Wait a minute. He's a Jew. Why does Hitler allow, yeah, of course, Hitler threw him in a concentration camp. No, actually, he was protected by Hitler because Hitler was deathly afraid of developing cancer. He is one of the few Jews that was actually protected by Hitler. And this led to some problems later in his life because, if you're a Jew protected by the biggest Jew killer of them all, you would be, I think your credibility would be highly questionable. Why were you allowed to live? Why were you protected by the number one evil man of all times? But the fact of the matter was he was apolitical. He really didn't care what was going on. He may have chose to be a little bit ignorant about what's going on. I don't know exactly why he accepted the situation, but it could also have been the fact was that he couldn't leave. He was in fact a prisoner, but in a better location than a concentration camp. So this is why many people have not heard about him. But he continued his research because he was a cancer specialist. The Nazi regime gave him all the resources he needed in order to continue research. So because of World War II and because of him being a Jew, he was not stopped from doing his research. He continued it even through the war. So he found out in his 40 plus years of research that all cancers had one thing in common, and that was a failure of the respiratory system within the cell. And a lot of people don't know that the cell breathes, but it does. It relies on taking in a couple of things, but primarily it takes in oxygen, and then it'll burn another substance, either sugar or fat, to make energy, something called adenosine triphosphate. The inability of the cell to use oxygen for energy would then lead to a process called fermentation. So if the cell could not take in enough oxygen, the cell would still need to make energy, and it would make energy by fermenting not fat, but sugar. Sugar only. So it becomes very hungry for sugar. So it would start taking sugar, dropping it into a pathway, which is, when it's combined, uses something called pyruvic, and then from pyruvic makes energy called adenosine triphosphate. And it would not bother dropping into the other energy production cycle, which if everything is normal with oxygen, called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. Dr. Warburg studied this development of this theory for 30 plus years and researched all types of cancers. And in his last, or his final big report, which was in 1966, I think, he said that he had been unable to find a single cancer that did not fit this model of development. Okay? So he knew what was going on a long time ago. So this is what happens. The cell needs oxygen to combine with glucose or fat, along with some minerals and amino acids. This is what, you can find this in any biology book talking about cellular metabolism. The mitochondria is a organelle. So within the cell, you have different things called organelles. And one of the organelles is called the mitochondria. It's kind of like your power plant, your little electric factory. Okay? And so when oxygen is brought into the cell along with some sugar or fat, with some amino acids and some minerals, it will then go into something called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle and start making adenosine triphosphate. This is what the cell needs to operate on, ATP. This is what the cell uses for energy. Without oxygen, the cell will drop into anaerobic, and that's the Latin word. Aerobic means air, and means without. So without air, without oxygen, it will then go into a fermentation process, and it will only ferment sugar. It won't ferment fat. It's incapable of doing that. And one of the byproducts of this fermentation is lactic acid, whereas the byproduct of respiration is water and carbon dioxide. So when it's normal, you produce water and carbon dioxide as your waste products. There's some other things, but those are the two major ones. And then from fermentation, it produces lactic acid, okay, and some waste products. So eventually, normal breathing or respiration pathway is permanently altered and the cell dies. And you think, oh, if the cell dies, so what? Make a new one, right? Yes, most of the cells do die. It's the cells that live that are able to adapt to using or making energy without oxygen that then will develop into tumors and then develop into cancer. So it's the tough ones. Unfortunately, it's the toughest that survive. You know, you want the wimpy ones to survive, but because they won't cause you any trouble. But it's the tough ones that survive. So, in fact, this is what Dr. Warburg found out. He said that these cells will have a preference for sugar only. So even when they survive, they become sugar fiends. You could give them oxygen. You could stick oxygen right up to them. They wouldn't know what to do with it. They say, we don't want this. I want sugar. I want nothing but sugar in my diet. So, that is why it's a very slow process. It takes some time. Very few cancers develop over a short period of time. And that's why it usually people who are developing cancer are a little bit older. Now, there are children that develop cancer very early, and the processes are sped up in their particular case. But the fact is that most people who die of cancer are usually a little bit older, mid-age and on, okay, because it's a very slow process for most people. Cancer itself, or a tumor, if you can isolate a tumor and keep it within a place, let's say you have a tumor in your stomach, but if you can keep it right there, it's never going to bother you. It's the spread of this type of growth going around the body, altering things and changing normal tissue into a cancerous tissue that will eventually kill you. Okay, so does everyone understand what I talked about with the respiration part? Respiration or with oxygen or without oxygen. Okay, so this is what Dr. Warburg found out. Now, there are some alternative views which we had discussed before we presented it. One is talking about the human papillomavirus as causing cervical cancer in women. Men can't get cervical cancer, so we're okay there. All right? However, only a small percentage of the women who tested positive for HPV, human papillomavirus, developed cancer. So again, like with smoking, if smoking causes cancer, why doesn't everybody who smokes get cancer? If HPV causes cervical cancer, why isn't it that every woman is getting cervical cancer? So there's a very low percentage of these women developing cervical cancer, so this can be a contributing factor, but not the cause. Another, cancer is genetics. Genes can be a contributing factor to any disease or disease pattern, but having the gene itself doesn't mean it will express or show itself. This is from a Reuters News. Genes don't determine whether you get colon cancer, protein does. So they were telling people you have a genetic predisposition for colon cancer, but in fact the research is showing now it's the protein, the lack of protein or the wrong kind of protein that can contribute to that. Other factors. Environmental factors can be a contributing cause to cancer formation, and this is well known and pretty much accepted universally. As our surroundings become more polluted, our bodies accumulate toxins which can't be removed, and this may be contributing to the alteration in cellular metabolism. So if you have something blocking the ability of the cell to breathe from some type of toxin or some type of poison from the environment, then you can develop a cancer. Our toxic burden becomes greater, our systems function less or incorrectly, leading to more diseases. So I put a little Chinese saying on there, dirty on the outside, dirty on the inside. It's Proverbs, old Chinese Proverbs. If you live in the dump, don't be so shocked.